Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our breakfast and panel discussion on politics and free speech on campus, then and now. I especially want to extend a special welcome to those of you who are here with us during your reunion weekends. For those of you I don't know, my name is Lauren Noble, and I'm the founder and executive director of the William F. Buckley Jr. Program. The Buckley program is devoted to bringing much-needed intellectual diversity to Yale's campus. We accomplish this throughout the year by sponsoring lectures, firing line debates, conferences, seminars, and much more. You can learn more about our efforts by visiting our website, www.buckleyprogram.com. I'll kick things off this morning by asking a few questions of our panel, but we really do want to have plenty of time for your questions. So please, once we get to Q&A, do raise your hand and we'll come around with a mic. Our only rule for questions is that they must end in a question mark. Please also be aware that this event is being recorded. Now, we're thrilled to have a distinguished panel here with us this morning. To briefly introduce our 5 panelists, Ambassador Michael Skoll is a leading expert in U.S. Latin American relations and international business practices. He's a pioneer in counter money laundering and anti-corruption services and training, and active as an advisor to governments, multinational institutions, and private firms. Before entering the private sector, he had a career of more than 3 decades in the U.S. Foreign Service. As Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the mid-90s, Ambassador Skoll served as a troubleshooter for crises in a number of Latin American countries. From 1990 to 1993, he served as ambassador to Venezuela, and he is a graduate of Yale, class of 1963. Former Congressman and President of the National Air Transportation Association, Jim Coyne serves as a senior consultant and director of business development for Cassidy and Associates. Coyne was president of the NATA for 18 years during a period of great growth and challenges in aviation, and successfully positioned it as a leading voice for the industry in Washington and representing aviation businesses at over 1,000 airports. Prior to the NATA, he represented Pennsylvania in the 97th Congress and later served as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan and director of the Office of Private Sector Initiatives. Coyne holds degrees from Yale University and Harvard Business School. He has also served on the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business. Next, we have Meade Treadwell, who is the president of PT Capital. He previously served as Alaska's lieutenant governor, elected to that post in 2010. Mr. Treadwell is recognized as one of the world's Arctic policy experts and has testified to Congress regarding America's preparedness for increasing development pressures in the Arctic. From 2001 to 2010, Treadwell served as commissioner on the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. He was designated chair by President Bush in 2006, continuing under President Barack Obama. A graduate of Yale College and the Harvard Business School, Mr. Treadwell has held leadership roles in business, helping to launch technology, manufacturing, and service companies. Next, we have Cameron Kaufman, who is a junior, or actually rising senior, majoring in ethics, politics, and economics. Last summer, he worked for the CNBC television show Closing Bell, where he helped produce segments and pitch content. Cameron serves as the vice president of the Buckley program. At Yale, he also hosts 2 weekly talk shows on the student radio station, one on sports and one on politics, calls play-by-play for Yale sports on the radio, and is the vice president of the Yale College Republicans. And finally, Raphael Steiner is a freshman, or rising sophomore, in Branford College, who plans to double major in political science and Spanish. In high school, he co-founded and moderated his school's political debate forum and spent a summer working at Vice News. Raphael serves on the Buckley Program Student Board as the Events Director. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. So I'd like to start by asking all of our panelists, how would you describe the state of free speech and overall intellectual climate during your time as an undergraduate? And how, if at all, do you sense its condition has changed since? I'll start, Mike.
Well, can you hear me? Good. First, I would like to congratulate Lauren and the Buckley program once again. For all of the ills we are about to describe, she and the Buckley program are the cure. When I was at Yale, I didn't encounter any problems saying anything I wanted to. Today, there is a real problem. And the problem for me started at a Buckley seminar conference in November of 2015, where I was spat upon by American Indians because one of the speakers made an offhand comment which was not against American Indians. The opening speaker, the master, and I use the word again, the master of Silliman College, Katsakis, started off by saying, I don't agree with anything that William F. Buckley stood for, except free speech, which for me was a signal of the basic importance at a university of free speech, more important almost than anything else. And from that moment, when we were spat upon, when students went to the president's house and woke him up at 3 in the morning, and Salovey immediately, of course, did what any great intellectual would do in these circumstances. He apologized to them for having failed them as students. How he failed them, I don't know. Anyway, the issue of free speech is under attack at Yale, at all American universities, most American universities. The problem is that Yale has become the poster baby. There was a time when any article in any major newspaper that dealt with free speech and a problem of free speech would also, there would be a comma after the end of the first paragraph and say, just like at Yale. And we were taught that we were going to be leaders, that Yale was a leader. Yale is the wrong kind of leader right now. And the answer to your question is it stinks.
Well, thank you again, Lauren, for inviting us all. I'm Jim Coyne. I'm really pleased to be here with you. To get to the heart of your question, what was it like during the 60s? I came here in 1964. And it's almost hard to imagine how different Yale was in so many ways, not just in the question of free speech. Think back to 1964, we had a president of Yale, brand new one, Kingman Brewster, who defined himself as a Republican. You know, I'm not going to go quibble about his politics too much, but I think it'll be a long time before we have another Republican as president of Yale. We had a candidate for mayor in New York City and also a candidate for the Yale College board of a man named William F. Buckley. I think it'll be a while before we have a mayor in New York City as a candidate of that stripe. Hopefully one of you young men will be the first. We had, of course, we had all males Whiffenpoofs, which was a little different back then, too. We had a former CIA agent as the school's chaplain, who you would hardly know by his actions that he had been, but of course, Mr. Coffin was a very important component of our free speech environment there at Yale in the 80s. Of course, we're doing our reunion right now, and 50th reunion, and we have a wonderful reunion book that has been published, and one of the most interesting pictures is a page that has a bunch of Yale students under the banner, "The Resistance." Sounds vaguely familiar today. And then they had a picture of the free speech movement, which they called, and of course back in the 60s, the free speech movement was pretty much led by lefties who felt that they had been unfairly limited in some way in their voices. We also had the FBI come to Yale in 1967 and investigate students who were burning their draft cards as a measure. Now, of course, there's a little bit of confusion about whether that was a free speech action or not, because there was a law against burning your draft card, and of course there was kind of somewhat of a silly law about having to carry your draft card. So the FBI literally came to the Yale campus in 1967 and started investigating who was behind this. And then most interestingly, I think, there was a tremendous dialogue between Kingman Brewster and Reverend Coffin about who was doing what to promote dialogue in the community. And of course, Brewster wanted very much to let both sides air their voices. I mean, he was, I think, fairly open about free speech. But William Sloane Coffin seemed to want to shut down the other side of the debate. And it was a troubling time for many, especially our senior year in 1968, when they did away with grades, they did away with requirements to go to classes, they did away with all sorts of, and so we had a very angry student body at that particular time. But none of them, I think, felt in any way constrained about, at Yale, speaking about what they wanted to speak about. Since then, I mean, you've covered it better than I can, and I think you're all very familiar with the reality at my college, Silliman College, which you referred to as one of the dark points in moments in Yale's history. But the good news is that the Buckley Foundation is alive and well, attracting new members, hopefully more students, and I think the pendulum may swing. We may swing back to the viewpoints of William F. Buckley and his great belief in articulating ideas intelligently, with wit, and with civility. And my hope that we'll see that some more at Yale and beyond.
Thanks. Lauren, just to correct one thing in my introduction, I resigned yesterday as head of PT Capital, and I'm running for governor of Alaska.
Oh, wow.
The question was, why would you be out of town for such a momentous announcement? And I said, well, I got to be at the Buckley Center. I'm very excited. And Lauren, thank you. I will just tell you, in 1979 or 80, Bill Buckley came to Alaska. I spent several days with him. We sent him up to Prudhoe Bay to see what was going on. And it really is a pleasure to see the Buckley Center here. My roommate, Peter Bowie, is here, and Peter went to the second Shockley visit to campus that had sponsored that. I stayed home to do some studying in my room in Silliman. But I will tell you, that was really the first introduction to the free speech challenge at Yale, which after Yale protesters had silenced Buckley in the spring of 1974, he was invited back during our freshman year, and the Woodward Report came out afterwards. And I want to say that I guess my sense of the time at Yale is that while there were some attempts at speech suppression, and I'll talk about a couple of others, the Woodward Report really did set a very good standard, which is to say that we're going to have good dialogue at the university over controversial views, and we're going to try to maintain order, and that protest is allowed, but protest is allowed outside. Interruption is not allowed. The phrase in our family, "stop talking while I'm interrupting," didn't apply at Yale. But I actually don't think there was enough talk about free speech at the time I was here. And there are a couple of other examples. I was an editor of the Yale Daily News, and one day, I don't think it was the day that I put together that editorial page, but we published an Oliphant cartoon which was criticizing what Andrew Young was dealing with in the UN at the time. And the Oliphant cartoon had taken a group of third world countries and had made fun of them. Bangladesh was bang the dish. Shad was Chad. And we found, or shad, which you can find on the menu at Maury's. But we were occupied suddenly by the black students at Yale. And they wanted to take over the newspaper. They demanded that the student newspaper yield its editorial control and yield its editorial page in apology for this cartoon. And that created a huge amount of soul-searching at the boardroom of the Yale Daily News, and with one group saying, well, we're the student newspaper, we should really take a poll before we opine editorially. And I said, no, I'm president of a private corporation which has free speech and can make it stand. But I will tell you, I'm actually glad we were occupied because it forced a dialogue. And at the time, I probably thought that cartoon was funny, and it is a whole lot less funny over time. And the challenge of development and the challenge of understanding what is sensitive to people and what is not sensitive to people, actually, we educated ourselves by going through that dialogue. And so there was no actual censorship. People had asked for it. We held up and said no, but we'll listen. And I think that sense of dialogue is very important. At the same time all that was happening to me, I was putting myself through school. I think I was in the last years, they called us bursary students. But I was working at the Beinecke, and my mentor at the Beinecke, Steve Parks, had written done a collection of books on the English book trade. And I'm staying with Steve here on campus for the reunion, and just looking at this at the time in 1663, here's considerations and proposals in order to the regulation of the press, together with diverse instances of treasonous and seditious pamphlets, proving the necessity thereof. And the point is that while we were having these arguments over in the Yale Daily News, we were also delving into reading other people's mail written 400 years ago, learning about the advancement of freedom of the press and how important it was. So while at one place we were having these arguments, the other place Yale was leading scholarship in this area. And I think the last thing I want to say is that I was on the Yale Investment Advisory Board. And this was during the time of apartheid. And there were regular protests, petitions, and so forth asking us to totally divest from South Africa. And this, as the student on that board, I was proud to be part of a process which said, no, we're not going to take a back of our hand out of South Africa approach, but we're going to review each investment. We're going to see what is being done to help advance the people who are affected by apartheid. And Yale, at that point, our recommendations to the board were to be very, very careful. Then I find myself late in life in the private equity business and calling up Yale and saying, do you want to look at a fund that invests in the Arctic? And the young analyst who was friends with many of my interns on Facebook said, no, Yale's not going to invest in the Arctic. It's way too controversial. And recently a group of fund managers said, we're not going to invest at all in any Arctic drilling or any of that bad stuff. And I guess the invitation that I would wish us to have is return to the Woodward Report, return to the time that we looked at apartheid, look carefully, because we are trying to do things sustainably. And shutting down dialogue, shutting down a discussion actually does not advance the social cause that you're trying to advance.
Thank you, Lauren, for having me on the panel, and thanks to all of you for coming out here. As a student, a rising senior who has been with the Buckley program since my freshman year, I have the most gratitude for all of you who, with your generous support, have made this all possible over the past few years of my Yale experience and have really enhanced my ability to learn at Yale, despite what's been going on campus. So thank you for that. What I will say is that the climate on campus right now is bad. It's not horrible. There is a lot of reasons to be hopeful. One of those reasons is the fact that the Buckley program even exists, and that through the Buckley program we have had so many great speakers coming to campus, and we have not only had good events, but I'm used to be the membership director, so I used to read the applications for new fellows, and our membership is about 300 right now. And when I would read the applications, it was not just conservatives and centrists who were free speech supporters. There was a large amount of liberal students who said, I disagree with a lot of the speakers that are coming in your events, but I really want to engage with the ideas, and I am perturbed by the fact that on our campus there is no ability to engage with these ideas, that in the classroom they are stifled, and that I am unable to get any sort of intellectual stimulation. And so seeing those applications give me hope and gave me reason to believe that, you know, what we're doing is something that reasonable people can come together and agree is the best idea for education and for our mission. So while there are many students who don't understand the importance of free speech, and they are backed up by an administration who has been very weak, who doesn't have a spine in dealing with these things, and I'm not even sure necessarily that some of the administrators support free speech. They are just kind of going with the flow, and they've seen the bad publicity that Yale has gotten from some of these incidents and then have changed their opinions. Even though those people exist, there are people across the political spectrum who have seen how fantastic the firing line debates that we've hosted here are, how great the speakers events we've had. We've had some really special events over the past 3 years, and they've really allowed for different perspectives to come to Yale and for students to engage with them in an up-close setting, a setting that they have not been provided by the Yale administration, who doesn't give them that opportunity. So there is not much free speech on campus, but there is this hole. The Buckley program is filling it, and I see a lot of hope for the future as well, because I do think the tide is turning, and people are recognizing just how ridiculous some of these, you know, echo chambers and ideological sheltering really is. So I'm optimistic, but that is the current state that we're in right now.
I also want to say thank you to Lauren, and like Cameron said, thank you to all of you. It's very heartening to see how many people, you know, still care about this and really have our backs, you know, as a college student. I'd like to focus a little bit on, you know, free speech and issues between students, and this is, you know, what I've noticed the most as, you know, having impact in my life in terms of free speech at college. I think there are two instances where you really feel the effects of what's going on with free speech in this country on college campuses. You know, one is pretty infrequent but can have pretty grave consequences, and I think the other is a little more pervasive, a little more insidious. The first is, you know, as a student, there's always a risk of saying something that perhaps doesn't come out quite right, or saying something that you do mean that's, you know, not particularly fashionable to say at the moment. And at Yale today, that can actually have pretty grave consequences. There's a very vocal minority of people all the way on the left who can be very cutting and can really, there's a big way to get your name out there and come after you in a really scary way. The issue that I think is a little more important is sort of how we talk to each other every day at college, in our classrooms, in our dining halls, you know, even in our suites. I think that's where free speech is the most threatened, because people have become scared to engage. And it's because of that vocal minority I just mentioned. It's because people are afraid of saying the wrong thing. And, you know, everywhere else in society, you know, you guys in your work and in boardrooms, you know, at kitchen dinner tables, you know, the way we get through problems is, you know, you talk about it. And I think right now, Yale, the biggest problem between students is people are really, really afraid to confront things in a day-to-day way. You know, if I'm in a dining hall, I'm often like looking over my shoulder, seeing who's sitting around me, and constantly checking myself just because I don't want to get into, you know, whatever trouble I could. And it's not for saying controversial things. It's literally just for, you know, working through these issues, working through our current political climate. And I think that's really the most pervasive problem at the moment. But like Cameron said, I think there really is reason for optimism. And, you know, I'd like to talk, you know, about solutions later, and I'm very proud to be part of something that I think is really helping to alleviate that right now.
Now, some higher education leaders have expressed concern about declining public confidence in colleges and universities. do you have any sense of how this erosion of public trust might be restored, and is there any hope on this front?
Well, if I can, we just had a big study of our class that was presented yesterday at our reunion, and they showed dramatically how much our class's confidence in higher education has dropped. And the researcher who's been studying Yale students and faculty and alumni for decades pointed out that this is the first time in all of the years that they've been doing the study that confidence in higher education has fallen below 50% in many of the groups that are being polled. And we had a big, long discussion about it at our class, and I think a lot of the viewpoint is based upon the perception that the faculties are becoming monolithic in their political viewpoints, and that they do not want to permit diversity in the faculty. I mean, if there's anything that Plato would urge us to think about is what makes education good. And of course, Plato talked about having very, very diverse points of view and rhetorical debates as the fundamental of education. And I think many people in America today think that our college faculties, and to the similar degree the administrations, have become one-party organizations, and that it's very hard for a conservative faculty member to get within academia today and have the career opportunities, unless you're at a handful of universities which are more open-minded about conservative thinking faculty members. I think that's a big part of the equation.
I think another part is that American universities, including Yale, are looking sillier and sillier. Free speech is a very good example. I cannot understand, for example, how President Salovey can say that Yale defends free speech, but at the same time acts to protect students from free speech. Most thinking individuals find these safe places and trigger warnings an absurdity. If I were sending a kid to Yale and faced with a $60,000 tuition and read much of this blather, I would question the value of American education today. Mind you, Harvard's worse. That has always been our saving grace, whether it's on the football field or in free speech. Harvard has set a new standard in absurdities, but that shouldn't make us feel proud, because Yale's leadership, the Woodward Report, was for years the gold standard describing what free speech must be at a university. And then in the last 2 or 3 years, it has disappeared. The baton has been passed to the University of Chicago. The Woodward Report has been replaced by a letter that the dean of the university, undergraduate dean of University of Chicago, sent to all incoming freshmen in 2016. You ought to read it, the Woodward Report and the dean's letter in Chicago. Now the University of Chicago is the gold standard, and I'm from Chicago, and a lot of my friends went to the University of Chicago, and I always thought we were better. Right now, in this area, we're not better, and when a great university, Yale, and a lesser place like Harvard look silly, that, of course, diminishes the confidence that Americans have in higher education.
I don't know how to fix Yale, but I'm sure glad that the Buckley Center is here. And one other Yale Daily News story. The day I became editorial page editor, I was asked by probably about a dozen of my colleagues, are you going to keep Richard Brookhiser on the page? Richard went on to be an editor of National Review. And I went to Richard and I said, as long as people want you off the page, you're on the page. And I guess my point is this, is that if we're covering up sculptures at the Yale Law School, I hope the Buckley Center has a free speech walking tour of Yale app, which will show you what's not there. I think another place that we have to be careful, and I think, Mr. Ambassador, talking about Harvard is important. When I was chair of the Arctic Research Commission, we held a commission meeting on the Harvard campus. And a congressman urged us to invite Willie Soon, who is seen as a climate denier, at least by the headlines. And I put him on the agenda, and a very distinguished Harvard faculty member sent me the most flaming email I think I've ever received about why I would ever put this kind of a denier on a presidential commission agenda. And I wrote back, now I have to put him on. And I was a holdover. I was in the Obama administration, and I said, Mr. Soon, you're headliner. And of course, that faculty member decided not to come to the presentation. But the White House official who was there, after listening to this, said, "Yeah, there is a deficit in science in terms of what's happening in variation of the sun." It didn't have to get into the question of are you not hiding science on climate change. The question is, are there factors that we need to understand? And I guess my point is this. One place is the Buckley Center stands up for free speech. I love the disinvitation dinner. But I also will say that celebrating where dialogue, especially in science, makes a difference over history is so incredibly important. We don't have ulcers today in the way that we had them a generation ago because a doctor who was thinking totally outside the box, was condemned by his colleagues, said, no, this is a different kind of disease. When you don't have truth, a space shuttle blows up. When somebody says, you better check these O-rings because it's been cold out there. No problem. When you don't have truth, banks fail, businesses fail, investments go bad. And often wars start. And I think the fact is that Yale does celebrate free speech and scientific dialogue. It needs to do more of it in certain areas, and I'll be on a climate panel this afternoon, and we'll say that. But the point here is that the building we're sitting in would not stand up if some people's theories were allowed to go into practice. And that's what we have to keep arguing about. So Yale is not just a social institution, not just a social science institution or a humanities institution. It's also a science and engineering and medical institution where we have to insist that dialogue happen to advance society. And if you hold that standard high there, it's going to be much easier, I think, to hold that standard high across the university.
I just want to make one more point on this question. I totally agree about the fact that the administration and the faculty they have done a lot to make America lose confidence in these universities. But I do think that a fair amount of this also comes from students in that, going to college, especially going to Yale, is a tremendous privilege. And being able to get this exposure to ideas, getting this type of education is the most amazing thing that can happen. And people on the left often who are anti-free speech also come off sometimes as ungrateful in that way. They're not kind of embracing this environment of ideas. They're not embracing the incredible opportunity that you can have when you are reading great works that disagree with each other. The incredible opportunity to have a speaker who you disagree with come to campus and to ask them a question. And by showing that sort of ingratitude, I think that the average American is wondering, well, what are these things, what are these universities for when these people are not giving them the respect they deserve? I think that is something that has really tarnished the university's image. People seeing, the whole idea of the snowflake may be overplayed in some ways in the media, but it does have some credence to it in that, these are students that are complaining about things that are a privilege in the end. And it just doesn't sit well with a lot of Americans right now, and it doesn't sit well with a lot of people who went to college before and who understand how incredible college was and who saw that every time that they were exposed to a different idea and they were made to feel uncomfortable, actually they learned something from it. And they're seeing these people and they're wondering, Why are they not understanding that this is part of the collegiate experience? This is part of our educational system. And why are they instead protesting and complaining about it? I think then the only way to fix the university's images necessarily in the public is for students to be more grateful and for students to be much more understanding of how to deal with college. And I think that if the public sees students going back and engaging with ideas once again, and they see that college is an opportunity for students to learn, then they will be much more receptive to higher education, because there's a strong kind of anti-university, anti-intellectual trend coming on the right in seeing the snowflakes. And I see where it's coming from, because it's very easy to look at these people who are protesting about the student income contribution or whatever, and at the end of the day, receiving financial aid from Yale is a fantastic thing and is something that is very special in itself. And to instead be protesting more, and instead to be saying that conservative speakers coming is a disaster, is something that shouldn't be allowed, really makes people kind of question, why are these kids going to these schools? Why am I giving money back to these schools? So I think that to repair the image of higher education, we need the students to be better characters. We need to be people that you guys in the room want to support, and you want us to succeed. And I think it's harder to root for people to succeed when they appear as ungrateful as some of the people do in my generation, unfortunately.
Totally agree, Cameron. Very briefly, I think one of the big issues in the public losing confidence with universities and places like Yale is because they've lost a lot of trust in the administrators who, in the last couple of years, the rhetoric has actually been pretty good from a lot of professors and, a number of presidents, university presidents, when it comes to the issue of free speech. And, like I said, what they say is pretty good, but when push comes to shove, pretty much always, if there's anything that's, remotely polemic or controversial, they'll come down on the side that, will get them in less trouble, and it's often not the side of protecting free speech. And I think, it's hard to be confident in education when the people who are supposed to be administering that education, seem so two-faced on an issue at times.
Do we have questions from the audience? Raise your hand and Ty will come around. Mr. Nelson.
I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, the last panelist. I was struck by what you said, that in the dining room, if you're sitting there, you think twice about what you're going to say because you look over your shoulder. This strikes me as the kind of thing you hear about in fascist regimes. I'm trying to imagine what it would be like as we sit here and I'm about to say something or ask a question, and I have to look around me to wonder who's within earshot. So I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit. I mean, you don't have these feelings because you're inventing them. I assume this isn't paranoia. I'd like you...
I hope not.
Me too. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on how you've gotten to this position. There must have been some experiences that either you went through or others have gone through. What would happen if you missed somebody over your shoulder, you said something that person found so offensive as to take action? What would that mean in terms of what happens to you?
Sure. So I think there's a ideal way for that situation to work, which is, I'm sitting with my friends and I say something, that might be pretty conservative or that might offend someone, and someone turns around and says, "Oh, I disagree, let's talk about it." That's how I wish it were, at which point I would never look over my shoulder. I think the worry for a lot of people like me is that if something's taken out of context, or even if something is not taken out of context, what can happen is, word can spread quickly, and, even if what you said was not that bad, with social media, people would rather sort of hear what you said and post, something like, "Oh, I heard this guy say this," maybe not include your name, but complain about it, then turn around and talk to you. And, as a student, I think it's very worrying to have that, and as a result, I think a lot of people, whether it be in a dining hall, like you mentioned, or in a classroom, would rather just keep their mouth shut, and I think that's very dangerous. It could be social stigma. I mean, someone could make a scene. I mean, it's all sorts of stuff like that, yeah.
You use the word context. I think that's very important because social media, and I dislike a lot of it, but that's my problem. There's a tendency today to talk and write in extreme shorthand. And it's like the evening news. Aside from the cute kids and the puppies, it's all headlines. Social media is all headlines. And it's very easy to say something and then have someone criticize it or go crazy over it or throw an egg or a tomato at you because you didn't have the time or the sense to say, however, I also believe this, and this is where I'm coming from. This is the context of this. I blame this quick shorthand society we've grown into for part of the problem of this automatic resistance and rejectionism. Because people will, if you use only 4 words to describe something, everybody around you is going to put his or her interpretation on it, and it's usually going to be bad.
I want to share with you the fact that I'm class of '73, that I felt the same way that you did, because I was not a fanatical anti-Vietnam War person, and so we had sort of a proto-Buckley program where a bunch of closet conservatives got together and we'd actually agree with one another. So, and even yesterday I was on a class forum called Route 66, and there were people who got up and said, well, I'm Hooper College. And they said it in a way that intimidated me, Hopper, excuse me. But the whole point is I felt intimidated because I'm from the college formerly known as Calhoun. And so the point is that you can say it in a funny way like that, but there is, and I'm still trying to put my finger on it, whatever, maybe my foot on it, thank you, Freud, to figure out how they do that, what is that condescending tone or whatever, like if you disagree with me, you're bad. And so, as anybody else, I mean, especially older guys, did you go through that same thing? Because I think it started in '73 or in that Vietnam War where the Saul Alinsky tactics were used to, don't discuss the issue, ridicule your opponent, and that's what I see a lot of. And I just want to, ask you about your experiences with that.
Well, our era was the golden age. We were all Platos. I had no such experience in my years at Yale.
Well, of course, the Vietnam War was a big deal in my era, but it was much more fairly debated because at Yale certainly it changed over the 4 years from '64 to '68. But at the beginning, Yale, believe it or not, was probably 65% in favor of the Vietnam War, and by the end of that period, of course, it was the other way around. But throughout that period, I mean, you had a Democratic administration, which, of course, was beloved by the left in many respects, pursuing the war. And so it made it harder for the traditional left-right division to occur. And we had we brought to Yale, and I was on the Yale Daily News as well, we brought to the Yale a lot of administration officials who were supporting the war. And Yale gave them a fair, opportunity to speak and defend it. And I thought, but it wasn't until your world, by the '70s, when I think that became a very different equation, and we had a much more balanced discussion of the war in the '60s.
I have a question. Is there any dialogue at all going with Peter Salovey, particularly involving university professors?
With who?
Salovey?
University professors in Salovey. Yeah, so the question was, is there any dialogue between President Salovey and people regarding university professors and their kind of political leanings? And obviously, I mean, you don't want the administration to be hiring based on political viewpoints. That's not necessarily a good litmus test that you'd ever want to be occurring. So it's not some sort of affirmative action for conservatives. While it would be nice to have conservatives on the faculty, it is that's an uncomfortable route to take, I think, to get there. The bigger problem is that Yale's administration hasn't talked to professors and hasn't kind of told them what it expects in the classroom in terms of dialogue and in terms of allowing a more open discussion. I will say that professors have actually, in my experience, been much better, and the problem lies actually in teaching fellows, teaching assistants, when you break off into section in a lecture class. And they are the graduate students who are often not so well trained. They have their strong opinions, and they're not good at allowing opposite voices to be heard. Especially, you get this in history classes, political science classes, where the discussion becomes about more polemical topics. So the administration, I think, they're saying, I don't know if they've done much, but they're trying to work with, the Center for Teaching and Learning to get the TFs training on how to deal with intellectual diversity and how to make sure that people in their classroom don't feel stifled, that they can speak, and that they have not created an educational environment where all ideas can be heard. The professors have done a better job, and I've taken classes where I've been very impressed with how professors have allowed for all viewpoints to be heard. I took constitutional law with Akil Ridamar. He is a strong liberal, but he was very explicit about saying, this is what I believe, this is what people who disagree with me believe, and this is why they make a good case here, and this is why they don't make a good case here. So he also had teaching assistants who were conservatives. That was a great opportunity there to learn from a liberal and then have a conservative teaching assistant. More professors should do that. And Yale's administration, President Salovey specifically, hasn't quite set the expectation for professors that this is what needs to happen, and that these are the examples of a great education. Instead, I think professors think they can run wild and the administration is not going to reprimand them if they've created an atmosphere where students feel like they can't share their beliefs.
Yeah, I have a question that you started to get into something that is a concern to me, which is the students that arrive here. Are they already been too coddled, and therefore they have to be coddled here? And maybe the issue and the social media, and they all walk around looking down at their tablet. I just wonder, how much do you feel that the issue is not so much even with the faculty, it's with the students that arrive. This is how they've lived, and have they been pampered, frankly, as I would say, in their high school or in growing formative years. And so therefore, the university, in effect, has to deal with them the same way, or it's going to be a disaster, even worse. I don't know. But what are your thoughts about the issues really coming from before they were here and the students being raised? And maybe you who have seeking national or office like governorship, is that something that is going to have to be dealt with at that level, and not so much, and the university is only a small part of it?
Well, I'm not a sociologist, and I can't describe the flaws of everything that's affecting the incoming freshmen. But I will say one thing about them that is really statistically accurate. They are not as well versed in the understanding of our political system, our Constitution, the Bill of Rights. I mean, I'm sure obviously Yale students as a group are much more highly educated on these topics than most, but it's dismaying, and truly dismaying, how much our secondary school system has dropped the ball in terms of educating students on the fundamentals of our democracy and our Constitution and the way politics is really supposed to work in our country. We've changed. It seems as though just screaming at your opponent becomes the model of American politics today, rather than lying about your opponent and so forth. And I really look at this very much as a shortcoming of our secondary school system. When I was young, we had mandatory courses in high school for understanding what democracy was, and we used to call it Problems of Democracy, and it was an interesting course and was mandatory in junior and high school. But that's all gone away, and I think we're suffering a lot as a country for that, and probably Yale is suffering as well.
Well, there's the rise of relativism over the last decades. There is a strong intellectual belief at almost all levels that there are no eternal verities, like free speech, that all cultures are worthy of praise, that no culture is better than any other, that no culture brings anything special to the field which is better than what another culture brings. I mean, I would insist, for example, that the English-speaking world, with a few French thrown in, have provided the basis for politics and political understanding and Republican kinds of government that is easily superior to anything else which has ever been developed in world history, including now. Now, that is not to say we shouldn't study other cultures, but number one, study your own culture. Really know who you are and where you're coming from. And then also recognize where we're better. We are better in those areas than in other societies. Maybe we're not great in certain artistic values, but in political culture, we are. But that is a statement which I would be paranoid to talk about in front of a lot of people.
It's sort of like they say democracy is a stupid or a bad process, but there's none better.
Yes, that's Churchill.
Yeah, we always do the right thing after exhausting the alternatives.
Yeah.
I'm going to say I probably was coddled before I came to Yale. I grew up in Sandy Hook, which was then a very nice country town, 23 miles away from New Haven, but it could have been 1,000 miles away from New Haven. I think I came to Yale and learned about kids who were really grappling with anti-Semitism. We had very few Asian students at Yale in the 70s. Very few African students at Yale in the 70s. I found myself speaking at Manuscript last fall, and the wonderful kid who introduced me, who was a graduate of United World Colleges, a group that my late wife and I had raised money for. And I said, well, I have a friend who was a doctor to the king of Swaziland, and he was from Swaziland, and said, well, I hope the king dies soon. I hope he's not that good a doctor. And I said, oh, well, wow. And why? And he says, because we're still trying to establish democracy. And the fact is, a more international Yale today, you would be surprised. There are kids from the Baltic region who are still very, very concerned about Vladimir Putin. There are kids from developing countries in Africa who are maybe part of privileged families, maybe not, but all struggling with how do you establish a reasonable liberal democracy in their countries. I've had more fun with the Chinese students who've lived at my house, because we do the AYA program and have a couple of spare bedrooms, who go back and having experienced democracy, having experienced debate, are trying one way or another to see a little bit more free speech in the countries where they live. So I'm going to say this in Yale's defense. I think a more diverse Yale is actually helpful to the advancement of democracy and free speech globally. And I think we have to capture that. You have a student body that is not, I think the snowflakes thing is just silly. We are still advancing, post-World War II, the advancement of people around the world and participation in their own governance that is incredibly important, that Yale recognized it has a part in that. As an editorial page editor, I had a kid named Papandreou whose brother was trying to run Greece, and we had, I kept having to say, how many editorials do we want to publish about what's going on in Greece? But the point is this: is we bring some of the best from around the world, and we introduce them to debate. Some of the barnacles fall off all of us. And I have never used in conversation, again, the phrase "a spade is a spade," because I did look over my shoulder walking up the stairs at the Silliman Dining Hall one day, and the face I got from the kid who was behind me, who was a friend, said, "Don't say that. That doesn't make any sense anymore." He later became mayor of Washington, D.C. I'm glad I had that over-the-shoulder experience. So, the sunshine is the best disinfectant, okay? Having more dialogue about this is incredibly important. and recognizing that the composition of the student body is not just, coddled. Yeah, we were coddled. I wasn't introduced to folks from other cultures before I came to Yale. And uncoddled with abandon.
Can I just briefly answer that? I really agree with what you said in terms of the fact that you came in coddled, but you had such an open outlook, and you realized that the way to get over this was to talk to people, and you recognize the value in talking to other people. I think the real worry today is not so much that this coddling is such a big issue, but that people come into Yale without the tools to talk to other people, and that's where we can, as the Buckley program, we get to think about solutions, which I think is the most exciting part. And earlier this year we had a lunch with Dean Chung, and two of the things that we suggested to him, which I think are very common sense, it could really, really help people learn how to talk to other people about things like this, are first, like Cameron mentioned earlier, assign freshmen, 2 conflicting books, perhaps on contemporaneous things, and have them read them over the summer, nothing too long, and then in your first orientation week, when you're in your orientation groups, have people talk about these things, and just get people to come out of their shell a little and recognize what you were lucky to recognize, how much value there is in arguing about these things. And then a second, smaller solution that we're thinking of is trying to get, students to read a little more, and trying to get free Wall Street Journal subscriptions for no, seriously, because we have free New York Times subscriptions, and it doesn't cost the university all that much. And I think I'd like to read a little more balanced coverage on Israel sometimes, and I think other students would appreciate that as well.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on something Cameron mentioned, and I'd like to ask the 2 students their thoughts on this. I'm in the field of psychiatry, and one of the things that we're concerned about nationally is a drift toward increasing narcissism with feelings of entitlement. And I think among the younger generation, the use of social media has fed that. Everyone's unique. They have unique names. And so part of what I've observed, and I'd like your thoughts on this, is part of the shift in terms of the way students feel about having been admitted here. You said they don't have the sense of gratitude. Is it because, in part, they have more of a sense of entitlement, and therefore, if you try to raise a conflicting viewpoint, then they're very defensive because they retreat back to, well, I'm entitled and I'm special, and because I'm special and I'm entitled, what you have to say, I'm going to discount or react very violently to. So I'm wondering if you think the sense of entitlement has contributed to that. Being from the South, we tend to raise our children with more of a militaristic, you're not entitled to anything. So when my children went to Harvard, by the way, they were like the only kids there that didn't feel entitled. And but they were both shunned, and in the case of my son, who graduated in 2016, he was literally persecuted, and he's a very moderate and very kind person. I mean, literally surrounded and verbally attacked, even for trying to bring up opposing viewpoints, and you're punished academically as well. So you have to be very careful and self-censor. So I'm wondering your thoughts on the entitlement issue.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very good point, because there is the idea that people are not necessarily as grateful for this opportunity of a Yale education does go hand in hand with an ideological entitlement that, I don't have to be exposed to ideas that make me uncomfortable. There's an entitlement of that which is very dangerous. You think, I'm very smart, I've done a lot, I don't need to deal with ideas that disagree with me. And then in conjunction with that, there's also an idea that, I got into Yale. Like, I clearly know my stuff. And if that's the case, and this idea doesn't sit well with me originally, then why should I engage with it? How could this person be right? So I think that you have hit on something in that our generation is, and I think there's good things to it, there's bad things to it. We have become very individualistic in a lot of ways, and our social media accounts allow us, through a Facebook, through an Instagram, through a Twitter, our opinions get much more traction than an individual's opinion who is just a normal citizen have ever gotten before. we are able to have an image, a public image, through photos that we post online. So it really allows us to create an identity, and through creating such a strong identity, if you accomplish something such as getting into Yale, you then very much attribute that to what you've done, and obviously a lot of it is due to work that you've done personally. But in doing so, it does create a sense that you don't need to engage as much as you would. I think that college should be a more humbling experience ideologically. I've enjoyed changing my ideas and thinking what I believed 2 years ago was wrong, and now I have a better sense of something. Or what I didn't know this 2 years ago, now I have a better sense of it. I understand it more. And I think that through the sense of entitlement, that's not a mindset that some people have. So I think you're very right to bring that up, and it's a very good point.
I really agree with Cameron in that people just are far too hesitant and reluctant to just go and get exposed to ideas like that. And the reason, it's a problem twofold. First of all, simply because, they might realize they're wrong. But I even think, and I think this is universally true, you can't really hold a position on a certain issue without understanding the other side. Your position is, is de facto weakened. And as a result, I think this reluctance that Cameron's talking about makes it harder for these people to learn. It makes it harder for them to talk to each other, but also makes it harder for them to have an impact, when they leave here.
We have time for one more question. Okay, up front here. Or Ty, yeah.
In public policy, it's always a question of what the alternatives are. And I think one of the most important events during the period of all of our activities was the Club of Rome report of '71.
Oh, right.
Limits of Growth, by two MIT professors. And I think that that's the conventional wisdom in academia, certainly, in the media, and with Democrats. And if you subscribe to that, as Jimmy Carter did, everybody's got to put on a sweater and get used to being miserable. That's one point of view. And my question is there any understanding of the unlimited potentials of technology, world resources that is totally contrary to the limits of growth thesis? And if there isn't, that's a sad commentary.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, Lyndon, because I ran for Congress, in a sense, because I was so annoyed by Jimmy Carter and the Club of Rome arguments. And of course, you can go back to Malthus and see people that in different times had this same view, that we just cannot, as a community, as a society, as a civilization, do better than where we are, or use our resources more wisely. It's a permanent struggle. I mean, I think if you look at throughout history, you're always going to see a side of the community that looks at the world as half full, and the glass is a half full, or a glass half empty. But I mean, that's one of the things that really is separating this division in America today that is so profound in Congress and politics and public. There are a lot of people who are not fundamentally optimistic that we can, in fact, make our world better. And I hope very much that Yale, and if you look at the history of Yale, certainly, you go back to Benjamin Silliman, who kind of discovered oil, and the whole oil, and the whole bunch of great achievements because of former Yaleys. I hope Yale today is spreading that word, that through technology, through innovation, through creativity, through the wonderful human capability to be inventive and imaginative, we will, in fact, solve the challenges that face us. Maybe, like you say, we will do everything else, the wrong answers first, and it seems to be the way. But I share fundamentally the optimism of Ronald Reagan and William F. Buckley and others that we must. We really don't have any alternative. We're going to, and I think Yale. I mean, I don't know. I'm not there today, but certainly when I was at Yale, and probably when you were too, that was part of our education to understand that we could do these things, and that's why we were here. We came to Yale so that we could be the next set of problem solvers, and there's nothing more pathetic than to say, hey, you know, we've reached the limit of growth. I mean, it's just stupid as can be.
I love the fact you brought up that question. Bill Moore, who was a classmate of mine and somebody who I argued with about limits to growth over several bottles of wine, it seemed, years ago. We've had a continuing conversation for 30 years, and he sent me an email saying, we're going to miss you at reunion, but I just want you to know that I've changed my position on limits to growth. And he's been one of the leaders in alternative energy throughout. I had a mentor who had no college education who said it was a cabinet member, and Wally Hickel, who said we're never going to run out of any resources as long as we don't run out of imagination. And what to me this says, and the free speech argument is really a much larger argument. It's censorship and free speech, censorship and a free press. It's academic rigor. And I will say that that's as important on the conservative side as it is, and we often say it's lacking on the left. Bill Buckley's God and Man at Yale was about the horror and the shock that Keynesian economics and Samuelson's textbook was becoming the mainstream thinking, and there wasn't enough thinking about free markets, and there wasn't enough thinking about whether or not this is government's role in society. That argument still needs to happen. The limits to growth argument needs to happen. And what you have to make sure, and I think one other place, just as an advisor for 2 minutes to the Buckley Center, is look at syllabi. And if a syllabus on a particular course doesn't have the good school of the other point of view, insist on it. Ask people to write papers on it. Look at it that way, because that's how we learn. And the limits to growth argument, I think all of us read Tragedy of the Commons. It was, I think I was given it to read in high school twice and in college twice, and then we taught about it later on. And that was also a limits to growth approach. And I'm so proud that the first political scientist ever to win the Nobel Prize in economics was Elinor Ostrom, who said you do not need a Leviathan in government to deal with resource conflicts. You need cooperation and communication. And she was a University of Indiana professor who may not have ever gotten on the faculty at Yale, but she was brilliant. And the point I'm getting at here is that if Yale is open to other schools of thought, or students looking at this say, well, what are the other schools of thought in a particular area, we're all going to be better off.
Linda, if I can make one other comment. One of the things that worries me about higher education today, and Yale as well, is that when it comes to limits to growth, the only part of that they seem to agree with is the reverse of it. I mean, is that there's no limit to the growth of government. and there are a lot of people in academia who that is their fallback solution. And Ronald Reagan's fallback solution, at least when I was there, was, hey, the private sector is the first line of growth. That's where the real growth comes from, not by growing government. And I think there are a lot of people in this institution who truly believe, maybe it's because of the contracts. There were no federal government contracts to Yale when we were here to speak of back in the 60s. And I think Yale has been co-opted by the federal government because now much of its economic future depends upon the federal government continuing to be the cash cow for higher education. And as long as that's the case, I think the limits to growth side is going to be misunderstood at Yale. Yeah.
Well, with that concludes our panel. I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning, and thank you very much again to our wonderful panel.